Alright, so in this video I'm going to give you a quick and dirty introduction and overview of the drum rack within Ableton Live. I'm going to start by giving you a tour of the interface, then we're going to talk about how to add sounds or create sounds inside of the drum rack, and I'm going to conclude with talking about the benefits of using drum rack while mixing your projects. So to begin, I first have to add a drum rack to my project. I can get there either by going to Instruments and dragging and dropping drum rack to either an empty MIDI track or an empty slot within my session or arrangement views. But you'll notice that unlike many of the other instruments that come bundled with Ableton Live Suite 9, drum rack in the instruments category here doesn't have any presets readily available in that view, and that's because they're all housed underneath the drums category here, and now we see all of the drum rack presets available with it. So if I wanted to add one of these, say, maybe the 909, I could just drag and drop that onto any track and it'll load up that preset for me with all of those sounds of that preset readily loaded into it. So that's adding the drum rack to a track. Let's go back to the default here and talk about the user interface. So the user interface breaks down into three separate sections. We've got the macro section, which are mappable knobs to parameters within our drum rack to give us a global control over sounds. The chains view, which allows us to see all the different devices or signal flows within each of these slots here. And then finally, the devices view, which allows us to see whatever instruments might be loaded into each of these slots. So now let's talk about how to add sounds to these and how the drum rack functions or differs from, say, the impulse within Ableton. So to add a sound, I'm simply going to go up to my samples here. I'm going to search for a kick in my samples. I'm going to grab a 909. Sounds great. Drag and drop it into the slot here. And now the basic function of drum rack is essentially just a MIDI filter in that it receives in the left-hand side all the MIDI notes that I could possibly send in from whatever my track is currently listening to, so wherever my inputs and outputs are routed to and from. All of those MIDI notes are going to be fed in to the left-hand side of the drum rack here, and then the drum rack filters those notes out into 128 separate slots. So you can see here I've got this kick 909 set to the C1 slot. So any C1 that comes in the left-hand side of this drum rack is going to trigger whatever is housed inside of this slot here. So if I expose the devices view for my drum rack here, we can see that housed in the slot of C1 is the kick 909 sample loaded up in a simpler instrument inside of Ableton Live. So simpler is an instrument that we've talked about in previous videos. It's just a sample-based synthesizer, and it's going to function a little bit different inside of drum rack than it does outside of drum rack, and that's that it's only going to receive whatever the one MIDI note is that's passed into or filtered by the drum rack. So in this case, the C1. So if I play a C1, let's transpose my keyboard down here. There's my C1. If I play any other note on my keyboard, you can see it's triggering those other slots, but it's not being passed along to the one slot that holds that simpler instrument. So by default, it's only going to give me the one or original playback rate of that sample there. I could add into this same slot, I could go to my Midi Effects, could add a chord effect to this slot. So now I've got in this C1 slot, I've got a chord effect, and I can transpose this up, 12, maybe 11 as well. Maybe transpose it, so let's go pitch. And so I'm constantly sending in a C1, but that C1, once it's filtered out, is passed along through this chain of devices. So I can have within these slots any chain of devices. So I can have MIDI effects, I can have synthesizers, I can have audio effects, all embedded within this one slot. So the most basic application of drum rack is just to have your sounds broken down into each of these slots, but these slots can get pretty complicated, and we'll save talking about the deeper features of building sounds or designing sounds of drum racks for a future video. For now, we'll just stick with the basics of single sounds in single slots, but know that there's much more possibility with what we can do inside of each of these slots. So I can add more than just sounds, as we've already seen, to each of these slots. I can go to my instruments, And I could add an operator to the next slot up here. So let's drop it into the D1. We can hear there we're just triggering a D1 out of this operator here. Actually, let's see what it is triggering. If I expose the chains view here, and then the input and the outputs within our chains view, notice that when I've got the chains exposed here, we get some more knobs here for setting what is currently visible within my chains view. And if I go I/O, we can see here's the note that it receives. So this slot here, the operator slot, receives D1, so it's filtering out of all the different notes we could possibly get. I could change which notes it gets, but filters out all the possible notes we could get and only accepts D1. And then what it passes along is a C3, and I can change which note it passes along here. So I can go C3. So I can pass along any note that I want to after receiving that D1. So we can have inside of these slots either samples or operators or any other instrument that we want, but it's always just going to be a single note that is passed along to that flow of devices. So let's collapse down our chains view there. So let's quickly build up a drum rack here. Let's get rid of that operator. Let's start with kick, then let's go back to our samples here and search for a snare. I kind of like that one. Drag and drop that in there. Let's look for a hi-hat now. Cool. Let's do a hi-hat open and a hi-hat closed. Got our open already. There's our open. So if you remember from the impulse, we can set up between that 7th and 8th slot we can link them so that whenever we trigger a closed hi-hat, if an open hi-hat had already been triggered, it will choke that or stop that sound from playing back. And we can do the same thing within the drum rack using the chain view here and then exposing the I/Os, and then these choke groups are the same thing as the link groups. So I'd come to my open and closed hi-hat slots here. Oops. Open and closed hi-hat slots here, highlight them both, and then set them both to choke group number 1. So now when I trigger my open, it will stop the playback as soon as I trigger the closed because they're both in the same choke group. So there we go. Now we've got a basic sound going here, a basic kit. Sweet. And now I can create an empty clip, start programming in. Notice that because I've got my keyboard folded here, I'm seeing the 4 slots that I've created with the names that I've given them. I can rename them by going Command R, kick, snare, HH closed, hi-hat open. Now when I tab back over to my clip here, you can see snare, kick, hi-hat open, hi-hat closed. Now I can start programming these things in. Boom, 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 doom, cha, boom, tat, 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 tss, tat. There we go. And we've got the starts of a beat. So the next thing, or kind of to conclude this video, let's talk about mixing really quick and why drum rack is a little bit easier to use during a mixing situation than the impulse. While the impulse, we could accomplish this, we'd have to do quite a bit more to it to get to this state. The impulse is, or the drum rack is ready to go. So what's great about it is that if I open up by clicking on the tracks title bar here, this little arrow, we can see all of the individual chains or individual instruments that are housed inside of our drum rack. So here's my kick, here's my snare, hi-hat, and closed hi-hat. So if I start playing back this sample, I can attenuate the volume of my kick or the snare, hi-hat, and I can pan each of them. So each of these are just like all the other tracks within my session view here, and I can even expose them. I can expose them by open this up, and now they look regular. And you can see here's the same controls that are visible. If I jump back to my drum rack, chains, I/O, all these same parameters are available here within each of these tracks. So note received, note played, choke groups, panning, muting, soloing, volume, so on and so forth. So let's stop that from playing back now. So having access to each of these is both useful in terms of being able to set the levels of the mix across my drums, as well as being able to set the panning or anything that we might be using during the mixing process. It's all readily available just by being able to target specific sounds. Where with the Impulse, we only have one track, and we've got to adjust or work with all of our drums as a complete set. So it makes mixing a little bit more challenging in that we can't mix specific sounds, but we have to mix the drum set as a whole, or the Impulse instrument as a whole. With the drum rack, we can mix each of the elements independently. So I could go grab an EQ8, drop it onto my kick here, and start adjusting this thing for my first dimension of mixing. Something like that. That's just a rough guess, but something like that. I can also use the third dimension of mixing, so the depth dimension of mixing, by setting up a return track within Ableton and within the drum rack. So first let's create a return track. Insert return track. Let's add a reverb onto that track. Let's go reverb. Let's just do a room, drums room, drag and drop it over here. Make sure it's fully wet. Since we're using this on a return track, we want it to be totally wet in what arrives at the master track. And then you'll see that by default, just like any other track within Ableton, there's only one send knob on the drum rack here, and rather than having a send knob on all the individual tracks, I only have one currently for the whole drum rack. So I can only position the whole drum rack within a space, which would work if I wanted to keep it as a very traditional sounding drum set. I wanted to have the drum set to sound like it was in one space together. But if I want to have different options for each of these different sounds, I need to create a return track or return track signal within my drum rack. So to do that, I'm going to go to the drum rack device here, make sure that my chains are exposed, then expose my returns within that chain. You'll see that when I toggle that on, we get a separate window that opens up down here. So there's my return chains down there. Then I'm going to control click within that space, say create return chain. And now I've created return A, and you can see that on all the individual tracks, my kick, my snare, my open and closed hi-hat, we have a send knob for each of those, or a send box. Now that allows me to manipulate how much of each of these individual instruments is being sent to this return A. But as you can see under the audio 2 here, currently it's going to the rack output, so that's going to go to the track itself here. But I can click on this and say, rather than passing it along to the output of this drum rack, so staying within the device view here, I can pass it instead to the A drum room track in, so this return track here within my session view. And that's where I want it to go to. So if I go drums return track in, now all these independent knobs send a copy of this signal to this return track. So I can position my hi-hats or my snare or my kick at different locations within the depth of my mix. So let's get this sample playing back again. Let's get the hi-hats in that reverb. Add a little bit of snare. Maybe just a little bit of kick, and let's pull out some of the dry. And there we have it. So that's the drum rack in a nutshell. Again, this was quick and dirty. There's a lot more that this drum rack is capable of doing. And hopefully in future videos I'll go into that. But this should be enough to just get you started in using the drum rack within your projects and within mixing. So hope this helps. Bye.